I was just the nanny, tucked away with the alpha's pups while the entire pack prepared for the mating ceremony. Little did I know, the Alpha King himself had abandoned the ceremony, his eyes fixed on me for reasons I couldn't comprehend, until he did the unthinkable. Chapter 1. Whispers in the Walls. The scent of warm milk and clean linen was Kelly's entire world. It clung to the heavy curtains, settled in the plush rug, and lived in the very air she breathed. Here, in the royal nursery, she was safe. Here, she was invisible. A ghost with gentle hands and a soft voice, paid to be forgotten. She hummed a low, tuneless melody, rocking the smallest of the Alpha's pups in her arms. Little Lyra, with a tuft of silver hair and eyes that promised to be as stormy as her father's. The pup finally settled, a sigh escaping her tiny lips, and Kelly felt that familiar ache in her chest, a hollow yearning for something she knew she could never have, a family, a mate, a place to belong that wasn't defined by the four walls of her servitude. This feeling was a dangerous indulgence, so she pushed it down, burying it deep beneath layers of duty. Because duty was simple and wanting was a path to ruin. She knew that better than anyone. From beyond the thick oak door, the sounds of the pack preparing for the grand ceremony bled through. Laughter, the clinking of glasses, the rustle of fine silks. Tonight, the Alpha King, Kaelin, was meant to officially begin his search for a Luna, a queen for the kingdom. The thought sent a cold shiver down her spine, a phantom pain from a wound that never quite healed. She placed Lyra carefully into her crib, the tiny wolfling curling into a ball of slumber. It was her job to care for the pack's future, even if she was barred from ever being a part of it. Just as she turned to check on Leo, Lyra's twin, the nursery door swung open without a sound. Lady Alara stood there, a vision of icy beauty in a gown the color of a winter sky. Her silver hair was coiled in an intricate braid, diamonds glittering like frost. She wasn't looking at the pups. Her gaze, sharp and dismissive, swept over Kelly, lingering for a fraction of a second before dismissing her as part of the furniture. A smudge on the otherwise perfect room. That look. It was the same one she'd received her whole life. The look that said tainted. The look that whispered of her parents' disgrace, a sin she was forced to wear like a shroud. Ilara's lips thinned into a line of distaste before she turned and left, the door clicking shut, leaving silence in her wake. What did my parents even do? No one would ever tell her the full story, only that their betrayal had nearly torn the pack apart decades ago. It was a legacy of shame, and it was hers to carry alone. Consequently, she found herself retreating further into her tasks, her movements becoming smaller, more efficient, erasing any trace of her presence. She straightened the blankets, folded the spare linens, her mind a whirlwind of old hurts. She remembered another man, a beta she'd thought she loved, his words like stones thrown at her heart. No alpha will ever choose the daughter of traitors. You are replaceable, Kelly. Always will be. His casual cruelty had been a brand on her soul, a truth she'd accepted long ago. The pack needed a strong Luna, a noblewoman like Lady Alara, not a broken Omega whose very bloodline was a curse. She was nothing more than the nanny. The sounds from the celebration outside swelled, a wave of noise and expectation. They were cheering for their king. They were waiting for their new queen. A sharp, piercing cry shattered the quiet of the nursery, pulling Kelly from her dark thoughts. Leo was awake, his little face scrunched up in red, his fists balled in distress. His wails grew louder, a desperate, heart-wrenching sound that echoed the fear in her own spirit. She scooped him up, his small body trembling against hers. She rocked him, shushed him, but his cries only intensified. So, she did the only thing she knew how to do. She began to sing. It was an old song, a lullaby her own mother had sung to her in hushed tones, a melody of moonlight and forgotten magic. The words flowed from her, soft and soothing, wrapping around the distressed pup like a warm blanket. His cries softened, then hiccuped into silence. He stared up at her, his dark eyes wide and trusting. Lost in the moment, in the simple peace of comforting a child, Kelly was completely unaware that her song, her secret melody, was not contained by the thick nursery walls. It was drifting through the stone corridors, a thread of sound weaving its way through the clamor of the party, seeking out a restless soul it was never meant to find. Chapter 2. A Melody of Fate. The last note of the lullaby faded, leaving a profound stillness in its wake. The silence in the nursery felt different now, heavier, as if holding its breath. Kelly held Leo close, his warmth a small comfort against the chill of her own loneliness. Her song had worked its magic, but the peace it brought was fragile, easily shattered. She could still hear the distant hum of the celebration, a constant reminder of the world she watched from the shadows. As she settled the sleeping pup back into his crib, two maids bustled past the nursery door, their voices sharp whispers that sliced through the quiet. "Did you see her? Lady Alara looks like a queen already," one said, her tone dripping with reverence. "The Alpha King would be a fool not to claim her tonight. They were together before, you know, before the northern skirmish changed him." The other maid lowered her voice. "Hush now. No one speaks of that. But you're right. Her bloodline is flawless. He needs a strong mate to settle his wolf. They say it's been agitated ever since he returned. Restless." The words struck Kelly like tiny, sharp stones. Flawless bloodline. Her own felt like a disease, a stain she couldn't wash away. She turned from the door, her hands automatically smoothing a wrinkle in a blanket, her focus narrowing to the simple, repetitive task. It was better this way. Better not to listen, not to hope, not to feel, because feeling only led to pain. The maids' voices faded down the hall, but their words echoed in her mind, mingling with the ghost of the beta's rejection. No alpha will ever want you. He was right, of course. Why would a king, especially a king with a restless wolf, ever look twice at someone like her? Someone whose name was synonymous with shame. In spite of her efforts to block it out, the gnawing feeling of inadequacy chewed at her. She was a wraith in this castle, her only purpose to be a caretaker, a placeholder, until the pups no longer needed her. Then what? Where would she go? The question was a terrifying, bottomless pit she refused to look into. She busied herself tidying toys that were already neat, her movements a quiet rebellion against the turmoil in her heart. She belonged here, in the silence, with the innocent. That had to be enough. It just had to be. What other choice did she have? Could a person truly outrun the sins of their parents? A sudden shift in the atmosphere made her freeze, her hand hovering over a small wooden wolf. The distant noise from the great hall seemed to drop away, muffled into nothing. The air in the corridor outside the nursery grew thick, heavy with an unseen pressure. It felt like the world had stopped breathing. The two pups in their cribs stirred at the same moment, not crying but sensing it too. A primal awareness flickered in the room, an ancient instinct she didn't know she possessed raising the hairs on her arms. Someone was coming. This presence was nothing like the fleeting arrogance of Lady Alara or the hurried footsteps of the staff. This was immense, a force of nature moving through the castle. The nursery door creaked open, slowly this time. The deliberate sound echoed in the sudden deafening quiet. Kelly's heart leaped into her throat, pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She expected a guard, maybe one of the elders. She slowly turned, her body rigid with a fear she couldn't name. A massive figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, blocking the light from the hall. He was huge, his shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the entire frame. She couldn't make out his face, only the sheer, overwhelming power that rolled off him in waves. It was a tangible thing, a crushing weight that made it hard to breathe. Then she heard it, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't a word. It was a growl. And it wasn't coming from the pups. Chapter 3. The Glowing Cinders. He moved out of the shadows and into the soft lamplight of the nursery. Time seemed to warp, stretching and slowing as Kelly's mind struggled to process the sight of him. The Alpha King, Kalen. He was larger than she had ever imagined, a creature of raw, untamed power crammed into the shape of a man. His black tunic was unlaced at the throat, a stark contrast to the formal attire everyone else wore tonight, and his dark hair was slightly disheveled, as if he'd run his hands through it in frustration. He didn't look like a king at a ceremony, he looked like a predator on the hunt. But it was his eyes that captured her, that stole the air from her lungs. They held a strange, mesmerizing light, like the glowing cinders of a dying fire, and they were fixed on her with a terrifying intensity. Fear, cold and sharp, shot through her. In his presence, she felt like a mouse caught in the gaze of a hawk. Her training, her life of servitude, kicked in. She dropped into a deep curtsy, her head bowed, her eyes fixed on the floorboards. "Don't see me. Don't see me. Please, just go away." She tried to make herself small, to fold into herself until she was nothing more than a crumpled shadow on the floor. To be noticed by anyone of high rank was a risk. To be noticed by the Alpha King, that was a death sentence. He was the one who upheld the pack laws, the very laws that kept her ostracized. Following that initial instinct, an eternity seemed to pass in the charged silence. The only sound was the frantic drumming of her own heart. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just watched her. She could feel his gaze on her bowed head, a physical weight pressing down on her. The air crackled with an energy she had never experienced before, a wild, primal hum that made her teeth ache. It was his wolf. She could feel it stirring just beneath his skin, a violent, restless thing that was focused entirely on her. Why? Why was he here? Had she done something wrong? Was he here to cast her out for some unknown transgression? "Kelly." His voice. It wasn't loud, but it filled the entire room, a low, guttural rumble that vibrated deep in her bones. It wasn't the voice of a king addressing a servant. It was possessive. It was a claim. The single word shattered her composure. She looked up, unable to stop herself. His eyes were burning now, the golden cinders blazing with an emotion she couldn't comprehend. It looked like desperation. It looked like hunger. His chest rose and fell in a deep, controlled rhythm, but a muscle in his jaw twitched, betraying the storm raging within him. He took a step forward, and then another, closing the distance between them with the fluid grace of a hunter. She scrambled backward, every instinct screaming at her to flee. Her back hit the solid wood of Lyra's crib, the edge digging into her spine. Trapped. He stood over her, a mountain of muscle and fury and something else. Something that felt dangerously like reverence. He reached out a hand, large and calloused, and she flinched, expecting a blow. But he didn't strike her. He didn't touch her face or her hair, his fingers wrapped around her wrist. His grip was like iron, inescapable, yet a shocking bolt of heat shot from his skin to hers, a searing warmth that traveled up her arm and straight to her heart. It wasn't painful. It was awakening. For a breathtaking moment, he just held her there, his thumb stroking the delicate skin of her wrist, his burning eyes searching her face as if he were memorizing every detail. Then, without a word, he turned, pulling her effortlessly to her feet and tugging her toward the door. She stumbled after him, her mind a blank slate of shock and terror. As they reached the doorway, he paused, his gaze sweeping over her one last time, the golden light in his eyes flaring into a possessive inferno. A growl ripped from his chest, a single, definitive word that echoed in the hallway and sealed her fate forever. Mine. Chapter 4. The King's Decree. The word echoed. Mine. It wasn't a word. It was a brand, seared into the air, into her very soul. Then the world became a blur. Kalen's grip on her wrist was an iron manacle, and he was pulling her, dragging her from the quiet sanctuary of the nursery and into the heart of the storm. The stone floor was cold and unforgiving beneath her thin slippers, a stark contrast to the searing heat radiating from his body. Tapestries depicting ancient battles and legendary hunts blurred past her vision, their woven threads a smear of color in her panicked sight. His footsteps were heavy, deliberate, the sound of a destiny she never asked for charging forward. Hers were a frantic, stumbling patter, the sound of a terrified creature trying to escape a cage that was already locked. No, this can't be happening. It's a mistake, a cruel, terrible dream. Her simple gray nanny's dress felt like sackcloth, a mark of her lowly station for all to see. She was a sparrow being dragged into an eagle's nest. They burst through the towering doors of the great hall. A wave of sound, music, laughter, conversation hit them, only to die in an instant. 1,000 conversations choked into silence. 1,000 pairs of eyes swiveled to fixate on them. On her. The room was a galaxy of glittering lights from the massive chandeliers, a sea of silks and jewels and perfectly sculpted faces, and every single face was turned toward the spectacle of their alpha king, their untamed leader, holding the wrist of a terrified, plain-faced nanny as if she were a spoil of war. The air grew thick with unspoken questions, with shock that quickly curdled into disbelief and then into contempt. Kelly wanted to shrink, to wither into nothingness under the weight of their collective gaze. She could feel their judgment like a physical blow, their scorn 1,000 tiny needles piercing her skin. But Kalen didn't slow. He didn't seem to notice the stunned silence or the dawning horror on the faces of his pack. He moved with a singular, terrifying purpose, pulling her through the parted crowd. Nobles in their finery scrambled out of his path, their expressions a mixture of fear and outrage. He didn't stop until they reached the raised dais at the front of the hall, where the 2 ornate thrones sat empty. He pulled her up the steps, his presence so immense he seemed to eclipse the very room. He stopped beside the Alpha's throne, a masterpiece of carved oak and dark fur, and turned to face the silent pack. And he did not let her go. Instead, he raised their joined hands high for all to see, the king and the servant. A gasp, sharp and collective, rippled through the hall. His voice, when he spoke, was not the measured tone of a ruler. It was the raw, guttural roar of a wolf claiming its territory. "Tonight, you expected me to choose a Luna." His gaze swept across the crowd, challenging, daring any of them to look away. "You expected a choice of politics, of bloodline, of convenience." He paused, the silence in the hall so complete that Kelly could hear the frantic beat of her own heart. Then his burning gaze dropped to her, and for a second, the fury in his eyes softened into something she couldn't name. "My wolf has made its choice. My heart and my very soul have chosen." He looked back at the pack, his voice dropping to a deadly, possessive growl that left no room for argument. "This woman is my mate." Chapter 5. A Throne of Thorns. The king's declaration shattered the silence, and in its place, a venomous wave of whispers erupted. "The nanny? Her parents were traitors. This is an insult to the pack." The words were like a swarm of angry wasps, stinging and relentless. Kelly trembled, her world tilting on its axis. This was worse than a nightmare, because in a nightmare, you eventually woke up. This was real. The hostility pouring from the crowd was a physical force, threatening to crush her. From this new vantage point, her life of quiet servitude had ended, replaced by a terrifying, unwanted role at the center of a brewing storm. She instinctively tried to pull her hand from Kalen's grasp, a desperate, futile attempt to sever this impossible connection, but his fingers tightened, an unyielding anchor in the tempest. Just as the murmurs began to swell into a roar of dissent, a figure emerged from the crowd. Lord Valerius, the head of the Elder Council, his silver hair gleaming like a crown of frost, stepped forward. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. "Alpha King," he began, his voice ringing with authority, a clear challenge to Kalen's own. "You cannot be serious. The law is clear. Tradition is clear. The Luna must be of a noble bloodline, a she-wolf who can strengthen the pack, not weaken it with a legacy of shame." Every word was a deliberate cut, aimed to humiliate her, to remind everyone of the stain she carried. The shame was a living thing, coiling in her gut, hot and suffocating. She wanted to bolt, to run until her lungs burned and the world disappeared. But Kaylin's grip held her fast. Kaylin remained perfectly still, a predator watching, waiting. He let the elder's words hang in the air, a testament to the pack's outrage. He let the weight of their disapproval settle on Kelly's shoulders, forcing her to feel the full extent of the chasm he had just created. Only when Valerius had finished did Kaylin finally move. He turned his head slowly, his glowing gaze pinning the elder in place. A low snarl vibrated in his chest, a sound so primal it sent a fresh wave of fear through the hall. "The law serves the pack," Kaylin growled, his voice dangerously soft. "And my mate will strengthen this pack, because she is mine. Her legacy is now my legacy." He took a menacing step forward, pulling Kelly with him. "Challenge my choice, Valerius, and you challenge me." The threat was unmistakable. To oppose his choice was treason. Before the elder could respond, another voice, smooth as silk and sharp as glass, cut through the tension. "Kaylin." Lady Alara glided forward, her icy composure a stark contrast to the king's raw fury. Her eyes were fixed on Kaylin, filled with a hurt and rage that felt far more personal than the council's political objections. "After all these years, after everything, you would disgrace your own throne with her?" The words were a poisoned dart, hinting at a shared history, at promises broken. It wasn't just about the crown. For Alara, this was about a deep, personal betrayal. Is this what love does? Does it curdle into something so hateful? Kaylin didn't even grant her a glance. His focus remained locked on the council, his message clear. Her feelings were irrelevant. With a final dismissive glare at Valerius, he made his decision. He turned his back on the council, on Alara, on the entire stunned and mutinous assembly. In that single act, he chose her over his kingdom. He chose his mate over his duty. And with his hand still locked around her wrist, he pulled her from the dais, leaving behind a throne of thorns and a pack on the verge of rebellion, dragging her away from the public execution of her old life and towards the terrifying privacy of his own. Chapter 6. The Scent of a Soul. The heavy oak door of the royal chambers slammed shut, the sound booming with a dreadful finality. They were alone. The opulent room, which should have been breathtaking, felt like a cage. A massive stone fireplace stood cold and silent. Towering bookshelves scraped the high ceilings, and the floor was covered in the pelts of creatures Kaylin had likely hunted himself. It was a predator's den, and she had just been dragged into the heart of it. He finally released her wrist. The skin was red, tingling from the pressure of his grip, a stark mark of his claim. He didn't look at her. Instead, he began to pace, moving with a restless, contained violence that filled the vast space, making it feel small and suffocating. He was a caged wolf, and she was trapped inside with him. The silence stretched, thick and unbearable. Finally, a small, trembling voice found its way out of her throat. It was her own. "Why?" she whispered, the sound barely audible. "Why would you do that? It has to be a mistake." Kaylin stopped his pacing and slowly turned to face her. The raw fury from the great hall was gone, replaced by something far more unsettling. The golden glow in his eyes was still there, but now it was awash with a desperate, agonizing pain. For the first time, she saw a crack in the armor of the Alpha King. She saw a vulnerability that mirrored the terror in her own heart. "It is no mistake," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't place. He took a deep, shuddering breath. "For 5 years, since the northern skirmish, my world has been gray." Muted. He gestured vaguely at the room. "My wolf senses were damaged. I can barely scent my own pack. Food tastes like ash. The world is a fog." The confession was startling, a secret weakness revealed. This explained the whispers of the maids, the restless energy he radiated. He lived in a sensory prison. "But you..." He took a step closer, his gaze intense, unwavering. When you sang, it was like the sun breaking through the clouds for the first time. I followed the sound, and then your scent. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if savoring a memory. It's the only thing I can smell clearly. Jasmine and moonlight and home. You are the only thing in this world that feels real to me. His reasoning was not born of love or destiny, but of a desperate primal need. She was his cure, his anchor in a world that had faded to nothing. The revelation was dizzying, a mix of pity and a terrifying sense of obligation. Was this her fate? To be a tool for a broken king? He saw the conflict in her eyes, the fear warring with confusion. He stalked toward her again, his large frame backing her against the hard edge of a massive mahogany desk. He leaned in, his heat and scent, a wild mix of pine and ozone, enveloping her. You feel it too, don't you? He murmured, his voice a low growl that vibrated through her. This pull, this certainty, it's the mating bond. It has awakened in me, and it has chosen you. He was so close now, his lips just inches from her ear. She was trapped by his size, by his words, by this impossible reality. The primal part of her, the omega she kept so deeply buried, recognized the truth in his words. There was a pull, a terrifying, undeniable connection that hummed between them. But her mind, her wounded heart, screamed for escape. The flicker of a single, desperate thought crossed her mind. Rejection. It was her only way out. As if he'd heard her silent plea, his body went rigid. A lethal coldness entered his eyes. He leaned closer still, his breath a warm puff against her skin that sent a shiver down her spine. His next words were not a request, not a plea. They were a vow, a terrifying, world-shattering promise. Reject me, he whispered, the sound a silken threat. And I will burn this world to ash. Chapter 7. The gilded cage morning arrived not with the gentle stirring of pups, but with the cold, impersonal light of a sunbeam cutting across a vast, unfamiliar chamber. Kelly woke with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was drowning in a sea of silk sheets and down pillows, the scent of lavender and old money replacing the familiar, comforting aroma of milk and baby powder. This wasn't her room. This was a cage, gilded and beautiful, but a cage nonetheless. Kaylin's threat from the night before echoed in the silence, a promise of annihilation that had stolen her sleep and left her raw. Reject me, and I will burn this world to ash. He had left her here, in the heart of the royal wing, a prisoner of his desperate claim. Survival. That was her only goal now. She had to learn the rules of this terrifying new reality before it consumed her whole. Later, 2 servants entered without knocking, their faces carefully blank. They carried armfuls of gowns in jewel tones, emerald, sapphire, ruby, fabrics she had only ever seen from a distance. The clothes felt like a costume for a part she didn't know how to play. The maids worked in silence, their movements efficient, their eyes refusing to meet hers. It was a new kind of invisibility. Before, she was overlooked because she was unimportant. Now, she was avoided because she was a scandal, a walking, breathing crisis in a plain servant's body, a queen with no allies, a mate with no love. She was more alone than she had ever been in her small attic room. A desperate need, a primal yearning pulled at her. She had to see the pups. Their innocent, trusting faces were her only anchor in this storm. With a surge of resolve, she walked to the door, her hand reaching for the cool brass handle. "Forgive me, my lady." A voice, polite but firm as iron, stopped her. A royal guard, clad in the silver and black of the Alpha's personal guard, stood just outside her door. He hadn't been there when she fell asleep. The Alpha King has given explicit orders. You are to remain in these chambers for your own safety. The title, my lady, felt like a cruel joke. It was a courtesy afforded to a prisoner. Her last connection to her old life, her only source of comfort, was now forbidden. Because Kaelin had ordered it. Because she was his possession to protect. "Let me pass." The voice was a silken whisper from behind the guard. Lady Alara appeared, her presence an arctic blast in the warm hallway. She dismissed the guard with an imperious flick of her wrist, and he bowed, stepping aside without question. Alara's continued influence was a clear, unspoken threat. She glided into Kelly's chamber, her eyes sweeping over the room with an air of ownership before they landed on Kelly, glittering with a cold, predatory light. "Enjoying the silks, little nanny?" she purred, her voice dripping with condescension. "Don't get too comfortable. He tires of his new toys rather quickly." Alara circled her, like a wolf assessing its prey. "He'll discard you," she whispered, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "Just like he discarded me." The words were a perfectly aimed arrow, striking the very center of Kelly's deepest fear. Alara paused at the door, turning back to deliver her final venomous blow. "An alpha's desperation is not the same as his devotion," she said, a cruel smile twisting her perfect lips. "Remember that." The door clicked shut, leaving Kelly alone with the chilling echo of her words. She stared at her own reflection in a massive, silver-framed mirror, a frightened girl playing dress-up, a temporary queen in a gilded cage, already waiting for the day she would be thrown away. Chapter 8. A King's Secret Heart. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of silent meals, empty hours, and the constant, unnerving presence of the guard outside her door. Kelly existed in a state of quiet despair, a ghost haunting the opulent prison Kaelin had created for her. The king himself was a phantom, a distant storm she could feel raging through the castle during tense council meetings, but one who never came near her. She was his mate, yet he was a stranger. The distance was a torment, but perhaps, she thought, it was also a mercy. It was easier to fear a monster than to understand a man. Then, one evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft orange, he appeared. He stood in her doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame, his expression unreadable. He simply said, "Come with me." Her heart leaped into her throat, a frantic bird beating against her ribs. He led her through quiet, winding corridors, his heavy footfalls a stark contrast to her own hesitant steps. They walked away from the grand public spaces of the castle, away from the throne room and his private chambers. He was leading her back to the one place she yearned for, the only place that had ever felt like home. The nursery. The 2 royal guards who had been stationed there since the night of the claim were gone. He pushed the door open, revealing the soft, lamplit room. And there, sleeping peacefully in their cribs, were Lyra and Leo. This was not a command. It was an offering. A truce. A wave of relief so powerful it made her dizzy washed over her. She didn't wait for permission. She moved past him, a quiet exhale of breath escaping her lips as she crossed the familiar threshold. She went immediately to the cribs, her hands moving with an instinct born of love and practice. She smoothed Lyra's silver tuft of hair, adjusted Leo's blanket, her very presence a soothing balm. The pups stirred, their little noses twitching, sensing her, and then settled back into a deep, contented sleep. This was real. This was who she was. In this room, she was not a scandal or a pawn. She was just Kelly. She felt Kaelin's presence behind her, a silent, watchful mountain. "They are not just the Alpha's pups," he said, his voice quiet, rough with an emotion he couldn't hide. "They are my brother's children, my brother Liam and his mate Anya. They were murdered 6 months ago." The confession hung in the air, heavy and sharp with grief. A hidden murder, not a rogue attack, as the official story claimed. This was a secret that could tear the kingdom apart. This was the source of the pain she saw in his eyes, the restless agitation of his wolf. He wasn't just a king burdened by a crown. He was a man shattered by loss, a guardian fighting to protect the last precious pieces of his family. He was entrusting her with his greatest weakness, his most profound pain. Who killed his brother? And why was it being covered up? The questions were a terrifying abyss, but they were secondary to the sight before her, a broken king standing vigil over his orphaned kin. In that moment, the fear she held for him began to transform, shifting into something new, something dangerously close to empathy. A fierce, protective instinct, not for the Alpha King, but for the grieving man, rose within her. Hesitantly, she reached out and placed a hand on his forearm. The muscle beneath her palm was tense as solid rock, but he didn't pull away. "Kaylin," she whispered, using his name for the first time. "Your secret is safe with me." In that quiet vow, everything changed. She was no longer just a mate taken by force. She was now a keeper of his secrets, a guardian of his heart. And she realized with a chilling certainty that to protect these innocent children, she would have to do more than just survive. She would have to fight. Chapter 9. The space between a fragile truce settled between them in the days that followed. A new, unspoken routine formed. In the evenings, after the castle had quieted, Kaylin would retrieve her, and they would sit in the nursery together, watching the pups sleep. Sometimes a servant would bring a bassinet to his cavernous chambers, and they would share a silent vigil by the fire. It was a strange, fractured imitation of domesticity, a pantomime of a family that wasn't real. Yet, in those quiet hours, she began to see past the crown and the beast. She saw the exhaustion that carved lines around his eyes, the gentle way his large, calloused hand would instinctively stroke Leo's cheek, the deep, abiding grief that shadowed his face when he thought she wasn't looking. A dangerous warmth began to smolder in her chest, an emotion she refused to name. This growing intimacy, however, was shadowed by a rising tide of political strife. Kaylin was under constant assault from the Elder Council. She would hear the faint roar of his anger through the thick chamber doors, Lord Valerius's name a frequent, sharp bark. They were using her, she knew. Her tainted blood was the weapon they wielded to question his judgment, to undermine his authority. Consequently, Kaylin's protectiveness intensified, becoming a smothering blanket. He forbade her from leaving the royal wing, insisting it was for her own safety, but it only made her feel more like a prized possession to be guarded, not a partner to be trusted. The more he shut her out from the details of the council's plots, the more the fragile trust between them began to fray. He was sharing his heart, but he refused to share his burdens, leaving her to feel like one of them. The tension finally snapped one evening. He stormed into his chambers after a particularly vicious meeting, a silent black fury rolling off him in palpable waves. He paced before the fire, his movements tight, his jaw clenched. Seeing his distress, Kelly acted on an old instinct, a simple gesture of comfort from her former life. She prepared a cup of chamomile tea, its gentle scent filling the air, and brought it to him. "Kaylin," she said softly. He stopped, turning to face her. As he looked at her, at the simple offering in her hands, the rage in his eyes seemed to just dissolve. It was replaced by a raw, aching loneliness that mirrored her own. He reached out, his hand closing over hers on the warm cup, his fingers intertwining with hers. "Kelly," he breathed, his voice thick with a desperate longing that made her knees weak. The air in the room grew heavy, crackling with an unspoken need that had been simmering between them for weeks. He gently took the cup from her, setting it aside with a soft click. He didn't release her hand. Instead, he used it to draw her closer, until only inches of charged air separated them. The space between them vanished. His gaze dropped to her lips, and the world seemed to narrow to this single, heart-stopping moment. He leaned in, his scent of pine and wild ozone overwhelming her, his lips parting slightly. This was it. This was the moment everything would change. Just as his lips were about to touch hers, he flinched back as if he'd been burned. A look of furious self-loathing twisted his features. He released her hand, turning his back on her so quickly it felt like a slap. A low, guttural snarl escaped him, but it wasn't directed at her. It was aimed at himself. "Get out!" he rasped, his voice a broken, jagged thing. The rejection was more painful than any insult Alara could ever devise, more cutting than the scorn of the entire pack. She stood there, frozen, her heart aching with a confusion and hurt so profound it stole her breath. The intimacy had been real, she was sure of it, but the wall he kept between them was just as real and far more powerful. And she was left reeling, realizing the greatest threat to her heart wasn't the plotting council or a jealous rival, but the tormented king who had claimed her soul, yet refused to let her in. Chapter 10. The Spark of Defiance. A suffocating tension had become the new normal. For weeks after the near kiss, Kaylin was a thundercloud on the horizon of her life, a distant, watchful, and dangerous presence. The gilded cage had begun to feel smaller, the air thinner. Kelly, tired of watching the world through a pane of glass, finally found a sliver of courage. She did not ask. She stood before him one morning, her spine straight, and told him she was going to the castle gardens. After a long, silent battle of wills, he conceded with a curt nod, on the condition that his guards surround her. It was a compromise that still felt like a leash, but the promise of open sky was a balm she desperately needed. The gardens, however, were not the sanctuary she had hoped for. A group of nobles was gathered by the rose bushes, their laughter brittle and sharp. Among them was Lord Marius, one of Valerius's most arrogant allies, his face a permanent sneer. He saw them approach and made no move to leave, his presence a deliberate provocation. He didn't address Kelly directly. Instead, he let his gaze slide over her before turning to one of his companions, his voice carrying easily on the breeze. "It is a pity, is it not?" he drawled, loud enough for all to hear, "that the pups of a true alpha like Liam are now being raised by that." The insult was exquisitely cruel, aimed not at her title or her bloodline, but at the one pure thing in her life, her love for the children. The old Kelly would have withered under his scorn, her shame a familiar cloak. But something different happened this time. Hearing him use her pups, as a weapon to wound her, it didn't break her. It ignited a spark of defiance deep within her soul. She stopped, turning to face him fully. Kaylin tensed beside her, a low growl starting in his chest, but she subtly raised a hand, a silent request for him to wait. Her heart was hammering, but her voice, when it came, was calm and clear as a winter morning. "You are mistaken, my lord," she said, her eyes locking with his. The entire garden went silent. "The only pity here is that a noble title is wasted on a man who possesses neither the honor to respect his king's choice nor the basic decency to respect the memory of a fallen alpha and his beloved mate." She took a deliberate step closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more threatening than a shout. "Perhaps you have forgotten who their father was. I have not." She let the words hang in the air, a reminder of a secret she shared with the king, a veiled threat that she was not the ignorant, powerless nanny he thought she was. The arrogant sneer on Marius's face faltered, replaced by a flicker of shock and uncertainty. Before the humiliated lord could utter a response, Kaylin moved. He was a blur of dark fury, closing the distance in a single, fluid stride. There was a choked gasp from Marius as Kaylin's hand shot out, grabbing the front of the lord's fine tunic and lifting him effortlessly from the ground. "You will not speak of my mate," Kaylin snarled, his voice a lethal rumble, his eyes blazing with golden fire. "You will not speak of my kin." He slammed Marius back against a stone archway, the impact cracking the ancient stone. "If you ever do so again, I will tear the tongue from your worthless throat." He dropped the sputtering, terrified noble to the ground in a heap. The message was brutally, unequivocally clear. The public humiliation was a warning, the violence a promise. Later that night, as a shaken but strangely emboldened Kelly walked the torchlit corridor back to her chambers, the lesson proved to have been learned. The whispers had stopped, but they had been replaced by something far more dangerous. A silent, black-fletched arrow suddenly thudded into the stone wall just inches from her head, its shaft quivering from the force of the impact. The game had changed. They were no longer trying to shame her. They were trying to kill her. Chapter 11. The Unlit Bond. The castle was now a fortress within a fortress. Guards patrolled every corridor, their faces grim, their silence a constant, heavy reminder of the arrow that had nearly ended her life. Kelly was alive, but she was more of a prisoner than ever. Kalen was a tempest of contained rage and suffocating guilt, his presence a constant, vibrating energy that left no room for peace. The failed attempt on her life had frayed the last thread of their fragile truce, and it finally snapped. It happened in his chambers, the air thick with unspoken fear and resentment. "This is your fault," she finally cried out, the words tearing from her, raw and ragged. "This cage you keep me in, this protection. It does nothing. It only paints a bigger target on my back." His control, stretched thin for weeks, shattered. "I am trying to keep you alive," he roared, his voice bouncing off the high stone ceilings. He swept a hand across a table, sending a silver pitcher and goblets crashing to the floor. "I am trying to hold on to the one thing in this gray, colorless world that matters." The argument was a wildfire, consuming all the things they had never dared to say. All her fears, all his frustrations poured into the space between them, a torrent of pain and anger. It was in the heart of this inferno that he finally let the truth slip, a truth more devastating than any assassin's blade. "How am I supposed to protect you when the bond won't even ignite properly?" he bellowed, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his body trembling with the force of his confession. "It isn't whole. It feels broken." He revealed the devastating secret he had been hiding. A true mating bond, he explained, was a roaring conduit of shared strength, of senses and feelings intertwined. It was a shield, a weapon, a sacred link. But theirs was just a flicker, a pale, weak spark. Because his wolf, the part of him that was meant to complete the bond, was too damaged, too broken from whatever had happened in the north. He could scent her. He could feel the pull, but the final, crucial connection remained unlit. The words struck Kelly with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Alara's poisonous whisper echoed in her mind. An alpha's desperation is not the same as his devotion. It was true. All of it. He hadn't chosen her. He had grabbed for a cure. A medicine that was now failing. Her deepest wound, the belief that she was unworthy and replaceable, was ripped open, exposed and bleeding. She was a failed remedy, a disgrace. The pain was a physical thing, a crushing weight on her chest. She wanted it to end. She wanted to sever the faulty, broken wire that was causing them both so much agony. With tears streaming down her face, she walked toward him, her body moving on autopilot. Her mind was made up. This was the only mercy she could offer either of them. She looked into his blazing, tormented eyes, the words of rejection forming on her lips, a final, destructive release. She began, her voice a broken whisper. But as she opened her mouth to speak the ancient, binding words, she saw it. Beneath the rage, beneath the desperation, she saw the sheer, unadulterated terror in his eyes. The great and terrible Alpha King was terrified, utterly, completely terrified of losing her. That single, unguarded flicker of his own broken heart stopped the word on her tongue. She couldn't say it. But the unspoken rejection now hung between them, a poison far deadlier than any arrow, a silence that threatened to consume them both. Chapter 12. A Touch of Moonlight. The silence that followed was a living entity, vast and suffocating. The rejection she hadn't spoken was louder than any shout, a final crack in the foundation of Kalen's shattered control. He stared at her, the terror in his eyes slowly being consumed by a wave of pure agony. A low, guttural groan escaped his lips, and he clutched his head, his powerful body starting to tremble. The emotional torment, layered on top of the deep, festering wound in his spirit, was too much. The dam inside him broke. A sickening crack echoed in the chamber as his bones began to shift, his form contorting in a grotesque, unnatural way. His roar of pain was no longer human, but a monstrous, bestial sound that ripped through the room. This wasn't the swift, controlled shift of a werewolf in command of his beast. This was a violent, agonizing unraveling. A creature of pure rage and torment clawing its way to the surface. He was trapped between man and wolf, his eyes glowing with a mindless golden fury, and all of that pain was directed at her. The source of his hope, the source of his agony. The half-shifted monstrosity lunged. There was no time to run, no space to think. The room was filled with the sound of its snarls, the sight of its massive clawed hands reaching for her. In that heart-stopping, world-ending second, something deep within her shifted. Fear was eclipsed by a strange, sudden calm. An instinct she never knew she possessed took over. She didn't scream. She didn't cower. As the beast descended upon her, she reached out. Her hand, small and pale against the raging tempest of his dark fur and shifting muscle, pressed flat against the center of his chest. And then it happened. A soft, silvery white light, cool and gentle as a moonbeam, flared from her palm. It wasn't a weapon of force or fire, but of profound peace. The ethereal glow sank into his body, a silent, soothing wave that met the raging inferno within him. The creature's enraged snarl faltered, stumbling into a whine of confusion. The violent spasms rocking his body ceased. The golden fury in his eyes dimmed, clearing like smoke, revealing the shocked, human gaze of Kaelin beneath. The raging storm inside him, the restless beast that had tormented him for years, was silent. For the first time since she had met him, his wolf was utterly, completely at peace. He stumbled backward, the last of the monstrous shift receding, leaving him fully human, panting and unsteady. He stared at her hand, then at his own chest, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. She looked down at her own palm, a tremor running through her. Where had that light come from? What had she just done? The moment of shared shock, of miraculous, terrifying discovery, was shattered by a sharp, urgent knock on the chamber door. A guard burst in, his face pale. "My king, we've captured one of the assassins. He's alive." Kaelin, his expression a mask of conflicting emotions, tore his gaze from Kelly and strode out to deal with the new crisis. But as he left, Kelly saw a figure lingering in the shadows of the hallway, Lady Alara. Her face was a portrait of cold, calculating realization. She hadn't seen exactly what happened, but she had seen the flash of silvery light from under the door. She had seen the raw shock on Kaelin's face. She now knew, with absolute certainty, that the little nanny was not just a passing fancy or a desperate cure. She was something more, something powerful. And the look in Alara's eyes was a new, far more dangerous vow. She would find out what Kelly was, and she would destroy her for it. Chapter 13. The Queen's Gambit. In the quiet days that followed the night of the silver light, a new and unsettling dynamic took root between them. Kaelin now looked at her with a bewildering mixture of awe, confusion, and a fear that was almost reverence. He kept his distance as if she were a celestial body he didn't dare get too close to lest he be consumed. But Kelly knew hiding was no longer an option. That strange, dormant power within her, coupled with the open threat from his enemies, meant she could no longer afford to be a shadow. Survival required a new strategy. She found him as he was preparing for the morning's council meeting, the air in his antechamber thick with the scent of leather and his own tense energy. He expected her to wish him well and retreat. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and spoke 2 words that changed everything. "I'm coming." This was not the act of a frightened servant being dragged to her fate. This was a choice, a deliberate step into the heart of the fire. She was doing it because the pups deserved a future free from the shadows that haunted their guardian. She was doing it because she was tired of feeling like the cause of Kaelin's problems instead of his ally. And she was doing it for the frightened girl who had spent a lifetime believing she should be invisible. as they walked the grand corridor toward the council chambers. A palpable wave of shock rippled through the castle staff. They moved not as king and servant, but as a united front, his powerful strides matched by her own determined steps. She felt the stares, the mix of stunned disbelief from the servants and the cold, undisguised hostility from the nobles they passed. Each glare was a test, and with every step, she refused to fail. When they entered the council chamber, the low hum of conversation ceased instantly. The air froze. Lord Valerius and the half-dozen other elders were seated around the massive stone table, their faces hardening into masks of cold fury at the sight of her. Kalen strode to his place at the head of the table, the Alpha's throne a fearsome construction of dark wood and wolf pelts. But instead of gesturing for her to stand behind him or in a corner like a proper attendant, he simply nodded to the empty space at his right hand. The seat was unadorned, but its position was symbolic, a place that had been empty for years, a place reserved for the Luna. The challenge was silent, yet it screamed across the room. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror and exhilaration. Every eye in the room was on her, waiting for her to falter. She would not give them the satisfaction. With a steadying breath, Kelly walked across the stone floor, her steps echoing in the charged silence. She reached the spot beside the king and, instead of sitting, she simply stood, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She met the glacial glare of Lord Valerius, and for the first time she did not flinch. She was trembling, a fine tremor running through her entire body, but she held his gaze, her spine a rod of solid steel. This was her declaration. I am here, I am his mate, and I am not afraid of you. The council meeting proceeded, the words about trade routes and border patrols a meaningless drone beneath the real, silent battle being waged. When it was finally over, as the elders filed out, their robes swishing with indignation, she overheard Valerius's low, venomous whisper to another. She grows too bold. This cannot continue. The other elder's reply was a chilling promise. She must be dealt with, before the coronation, or all is lost. Her gambit had succeeded. They no longer saw her as a pawn. They saw her as a threat that had to be eliminated. Chapter 14. A Taste of Betrayal. An uneasy quiet settled over the castle in the following week, the kind of tense stillness that precedes a storm. Kelly, emboldened by her small victory, began to carve out a space for herself. She even thought she had found an ally. A young serving girl named Lena, with wide, innocent eyes and a gentle smile, was one of the few who didn't treat her like a pariah. Lena would bring her meals, sharing small tidbits of harmless gossip, her warmth a welcome balm in the cold, hostile environment. Kelly had begun to trust her, to see her as a small point of light in the overwhelming darkness. That trust would be her undoing. One evening, Lena brought her dinner tray as usual, but with it was a special goblet of dark, spiced wine. "A gift, my lady," she said, her smile as sweet as ever. "To help with the nerves." Grateful for the simple act of kindness, Kelly accepted the drink, savoring its warmth as it slid down her throat. The effect was not immediate. At first, it was a pleasant heat that spread through her limbs, a welcome relaxation, but the warmth soon gave way to a creeping numbness. Her fingers felt heavy, her thoughts slow and sticky. When she tried to stand, her legs refused to cooperate, buckling beneath her. A cold dread washed over her as her vision began to blur at the edges, the vibrant colors of the room fading to a murky gray. Something was terribly, horribly wrong. She stumbled toward the door, a silent scream trapped in her throat, which felt as if it were closing up, strangling her from the inside out. Then, the world went black. Kalen found her. The sound that ripped from his chest was not human. It was a roar of pure, apocalyptic grief and rage, a sound that shook the very foundations of the castle. He bellowed for guards, for healers, his voice the sound of a world breaking apart. The court came running, drawn by the terrifying sound, only to be met with the sight of their king losing his war for control. Claws, long and black as obsidian, tore through the skin of his fingertips. His eyes blazed with the untamed fire of his wolf. The agony of seeing her dying on the floor shattered his sanity, and he turned on the onlookers, a whirlwind of destructive fury, a half-shifted beast on the verge of slaughtering every person in the room. As the darkness threatened to pull her under completely, Kelly saw the monster he had become in his grief for her. And in that terrifying, beautiful moment, she felt no fear. With the last ounce of her strength, she pushed herself forward, her hand reaching out to clutch his face, now contorted in a snarl of pain. His skin was hot, his cheek bristling with coarse fur. She pulled him down, her voice a choked, ragged whisper that was somehow louder than his rage. "Kaylin," she breathed, her touch a final, desperate anchor. "I'm not afraid of you." Her words, her touch, pierced the red haze of his fury. It was the only thing that could have stopped him. He froze, the monster in his eyes receding, replaced by the terrified man. With a sob that sounded like it was torn from his soul, he scooped her limp body into his arms, his form still trembling on the precipice of the beast, and roared for the royal healer. His love and his rage were now one, a terrifying, inseparable force, and the question of who had betrayed her was second only to whether she could be saved at all. Chapter 15. Trial by Fire. She survived. The royal healer's ancient knowledge, combined with a strange, resilient life force within her that actively fought the poison, pulled her back from the brink. She awoke weak but alive, the betrayal having burned away her last vestiges of fear and replaced them with a cold, hard resolve. The castle was in chaos. Lena, the sweet-faced servant, had vanished, her disappearance a clear confession of her guilt and her allegiance to the council. Kaylin, now consumed by a singular need to both avenge her and solidify her position beyond any doubt, made a desperate gamble. He invoked the Luna trials, a set of ancient, perilous rites of passage designed to prove a mate's worthiness to the pack and the gods themselves. It was a tradition that hadn't been used in centuries, and it was his final, defiant move against his enemies. The first trial took place at dawn in the sacred grove, a circle of ancient, moss-covered monoliths that pulsed with old magic. It was a trial of the spirit. Kelly had to walk a winding, ethereal path to retrieve a moonstone from the grove's heart, all while braving magical illusions designed to manifest her deepest fears and insecurities. Lord Valerius and the other elders were there to officiate, their faces impassive stone masks. Alara watched from the edge of the clearing, a smug, predatory smile on her lips, certain that the little nanny would be broken by her own demons. As Kelly stepped onto the path, the world around her shimmered and changed, the whispers of her past rejections and the faces of scornful nobles swirling around her like phantoms in the mist. She pushed through them, her focus narrowed on the glint of the moonstone ahead. But just as she neared her goal, the trial was shattered. A group of black-clad assassins swarmed into the sacred grove, their blades gleaming in the dawn light. This was the council's final desperate gambit, to murder her during the trial and claim the sacred magic itself had rejected her. Chaos erupted as the royal guards clashed with the attackers. In the ensuing melee, one of the assassins broke free, his eyes landing on an easier, more strategic target. In a special pavilion set aside for the ceremony, Lyra and Leo lay in their bassinet. The killer saw his chance to wound the king in the deepest way possible. Kelly saw him too. Without a moment's hesitation, she abandoned the trial, her own safety forgotten. She launched herself forward, a desperate, protective instinct overriding everything else. She threw her body in front of the bassinet, shielding the pups with her own, just as the assassin's dagger plunged downward. A searing, white-hot pain exploded in her shoulder. But the pups were safe. Kaylin, having just felled another attacker, witnessed the entire act. He saw her bleed to protect his kin, his future, his heart. For him, the trial was over. She had proven her worth not with magic, but with a love so fierce it defied death. As he roared and charged the final assassin, Alara saw her own opportunity in the chaos. With Kelly wounded and Kaylin distracted, she stepped into the center of the grove, her voice ringing out with triumphant malice for all to hear. "She bleeds with courage, I'll grant you that, but it is the courage of a traitor's whelp," she screamed, her words echoing off the ancient stones. "Her blood is a poison. She is the daughter of Maris and Lorien, the very wolves who betrayed the last king and tried to sell this pack to our sworn enemies." Her moment of greatest heroism was instantly eclipsed by the public revelation of her deepest shame, her family's ultimate sin laid bare for the entire world to see. Chapter 16. Sins of the Father. The echo of Alara's accusation, daughter of Maris and Lorien, hung in the stunned silence of the sacred grove. The words were a death sentence. The sharp, throbbing pain in Kelly's shoulder was nothing, a distant fire compared to the inferno of shame and horror that consumed her now. She could feel the very air shift. The pack members who had witnessed her brave act, who had seen her bleed for their future alphas, now stared at her with a dawning, sickening horror. The brief flicker of respect in their eyes was extinguished, replaced by the familiar, ugly glint of suspicion and hatred. In the space of a single breath, she had been transformed from a hero back into a curse. Her family's sin was a ghost that would haunt her forever. Lord Valerius, his face a mask of righteous fury, seized the moment. He strode into the center of the clearing, his powerful voice booming with authority, turning the pact's confusion into a weapon. "It all makes sense now," he declared, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at Kelly, who was still slumped against the bassinet, Kaelin a furious wall at her back. "This is not the king's fated mate. This is a viper we welcomed into our midst." He didn't just condemn her parents. He twisted the events of the past few months into a sinister narrative. The king's strange obsession, the attacks on her life, staged to make her seem a victim. It is all a lie, a venomous plot to finish the treason her parents began. The accusation was masterful in its cruelty, a poison that seeped into the ears of the already fearful pack. This was it, her absolute rock bottom. Wounded, exposed, and now framed as the mastermind of a conspiracy she couldn't even comprehend. The faces in the crowd, once individuals, now blurred into a single monstrous entity of judgment. Their low, angry growls were a physical force pressing in on her, suffocating her. Her deepest, darkest fear, the core belief that she was a blight upon the world, screamed its victory in her mind. "See? You are not just unworthy. You are a poison." Kaelin held her tighter, his own snarl a defiant roar against the rising tide, but even he could not hold back the sea. "She stands accused of high treason," Valerius boomed, his voice resonating with finality. "By the ancient laws there is only one punishment: she must be executed." The demand for her death rippled through the onlookers, a chant of "justice" and "traitor" rising from the crowd. The royal guards who had just fought to protect her now looked uncertain, their loyalty split between their alpha king and the undeniable weight of pack law and tradition. Their spears, which had been pointed outward at the assassins, now seemed to be slowly turning inward, forming a tense, glittering cage. Kaelin scooped her into his arms, his movements radiating a furious, desperate defiance. He carried her from the grove, not as a conquering hero with his Luna, but as a cornered king retreating with his accused, traitorous mate. She buried her face in his chest, the scent of his fury a strange comfort in the utter devastation of her world. She had been named a hero and a traitor in the same instant, and now, the pack she had saved was baying for her blood. Chapter 17, Crown Against Heart. Her shoulder had been cleaned and bandaged by the royal healer, the physical wound a neat, searing line of pain. It was a tangible proof of her loyalty, a testament to her sacrifice, and yet it meant nothing. In the eyes of the pack, the scar she would carry was merely another mark of her deceit. Kaelin stayed with her in the chambers that had become her world, but he was no longer a king radiating power. He was a tormented man, pacing the length of the room like a caged lion, his helplessness a far more terrifying sight than his rage had ever been. The crown was a lead weight on his brow, his kingdom a thing he could no longer control. A royal messenger, a young wolf with a pale, frightened face, arrived with the news that sealed their fate. Lord Valerius, in his righteous fury, had successfully rallied the other noble houses. Their message was an ultimatum: deliver the traitor's daughter for judgment and execution, or they would secede. They would shatter the kingdom, plunging the pack into a bloody civil war, brother against brother, until the taint was purged. The nation Kaelin had sworn his life to protect, the people he loved, the legacy of his ancestors. It was all about to be torn apart, because of her, because of his choice. The agony on his face was a sight she would never forget. He was being crushed between two impossible loves, his duty to his people and the primal, soul-deep command to protect his mate. Seeing him so broken, so utterly torn, awakened the ghost that lived inside her. The old, familiar belief that she was a burden, a curse, a replaceable thing whose only value was in being erased. Her life was not worth the blood of a single pack member, let alone the destruction of an entire kingdom. Love, she realized in that devastating moment, was not about holding on. It was about letting go. With tears streaming down her cheeks, she went to him, her hands finding his, her touch a plea. "Let me go, Kaelin," she begged, her voice breaking on a sob. "Give me to them. Please, don't let the pack bleed for me. My life, it isn't worth it." It was the ultimate expression of her own brokenness, a desperate attempt to prove the terrible lie she had always believed about herself. He stared at her, his golden eyes a maelstrom of conflict. His every instinct as an alpha, as a male who had found his other half, screamed at him to protect her, to fulfill his promise to burn the world down for her. But the weight of the crown, the centuries of duty ingrained in his blood, demanded the sacrifice. It was a choice that would destroy him either way. As they stood locked in that terrible, silent stalemate, a figure appeared in the doorway. Alara. The guards had not stopped her. The council's power was now absolute. She looked at Kelly, not with triumph, but with a mask of soft, calculated pity that was far more cruel. "Oh, you poor, naive thing," she whispered, her voice a venomous caress meant only for Kelly to hear. "Don't you see how this ends?" She glided closer, her gaze flickering to the tormented king. "He is an alpha. In the end, a true alpha always protects the pack. He will always choose the kingdom." She let the words sink in, a final, devastating poison, before turning and gliding away. Kaelin's tortured silence in the face of her plea felt like a confirmation. Alara was right. The choice was already made. Chapter 18. The Price of a Soul. The Great Hall was repurposed for a spectacle of judgment. Gone were the sounds of celebration, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. Kelly stood on a raised wooden platform in the center of the vast room, facing the grim-faced council and the assembled masses of the pack. She felt a strange, hollow calm settle over her. She had accepted this. Her death would be her final act of love, the only way to mend the world she had helped to break. The wound in her shoulder ached, a dull throb that anchored her to the present moment. She was ready. Lord Valerius presided, his voice ringing with grim satisfaction as he listed the trumped-up charges. He spoke of her parents' betrayal in lurid detail, finally revealing the full, twisted version of their crime, selling pack secrets, enabling an enemy ambush that had cost dozens of lives. He painted Kelly not as their innocent daughter, but as their patient, vengeful legacy. The evidence was nothing, whispers and shadows, but the pack, desperate for a scapegoat, drank it in. Just as Valerius raised his hand to pronounce the inevitable verdict of death, the great doors of the hall swung open. Kaelin entered. But this was not the king they knew. He wore no crown, no royal finery. He was dressed in simple black leather, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes held a terrifying, resolute calm. He did not go to the empty throne. He walked through the parted crowd, his steps slow and deliberate, until he reached the platform where she stood. He faced the council, his gaze sweeping over them, devoid of rage, filled only with a profound, bone-deep sorrow. "You demand a price for the sins of the past," he said, his voice quiet but resonating with such power that it filled every corner of the hall. "You believe she is that price. You are wrong." He did not argue. He did not plead. He offered them a trade. He drew the ancient, ceremonial dagger from the sheath at his belt and laid it on the platform between them. Then, in a move that sent a collective gasp of shock through the entire pack, he twisted the Alpha King's signet ring from his finger, the symbol of his power, the heart of the kingdom. "I am the price," he declared, his voice breaking with the weight of his own words. He placed the ring beside the dagger. "I will renounce my throne. I will abdicate my rule and surrender my power to this council." He looked at Valerius, his eyes burning with an unconditional love that was a weapon all its own. "I will give you my crown, my kingdom, my entire life, in exchange for hers." The world stopped. This singular, impossible act shattered Kelly's entire understanding of her own worth. He was choosing her, not just over his own life, but over his sacred duty, his legacy, his very soul. He was proving, in the most absolute way imaginable, that she was not replaceable. The realization was a devastating, beautiful agony. She could not let him do this. She would scream her guilt. She would lunge for the dagger herself. She would do anything to stop him from paying this price. She opened her mouth to refuse, to sacrifice herself as she had always intended. At that exact moment, a single, pure beam of white light lanced through a high window, illuminating the platform in an ethereal glow. The full moon was rising. A low, guttural sound of torment started deep in Kalen's chest. It grew into a roar of heart-shattering agony as his body began to tremble violently, the strain of offering his own soul for hers finally breaking the fragile hold he had on his damaged, tormented wolf. Chapter 19. Blood of the Moon. Kalen's roar of agony was the sound of a soul tearing itself apart. He was breaking, shattering under the impossible weight of his sacrifice, the moonlight a merciless spotlight on his torment. The pack, moments before a unified mob of judgment, was now a chaotic mess of fear and confusion. In that instant, watching him come undone for her, something inside Kelly shifted. The quiet, desperate wish to die to save him was burned away, replaced by a ferocious, undeniable need to live for him, to fight for him, to pull him back from the abyss he was willingly throwing himself into for her sake. The beam of moonlight streaming through the window didn't feel cold. As it touched her skin, her bandaged shoulder, it felt like a jolt of life, a surge of impossible warmth that spread through her veins like a river of liquid starlight. The whispers about her parents, the architects of her lifelong shame, echoed in her mind. But the words were different now. They were no longer an accusation, but a question. What if the story you were told was a lie? What if her blood wasn't a poison, but a legacy of something else entirely? Something feared. Something powerful. As Kalen's body began to contort, the agonized shift threatening to consume him completely, she moved. Ignoring the panicked shouts from the council and the gasps from the pack, she walked back onto the platform. She was no longer a victim awaiting judgment. She was a woman walking toward her destiny. She placed both her hands flat against his chest, right over his heart. This time, it was not a flicker. It was a flood. A brilliant, blinding torrent of silver-white light erupted from her palms, pouring into his body. The light was cool, calming, and it carried the impossible scent of night-blooming jasmine and ancient, sacred places. The entire hall gasped as one. The moonlight in the room seemed to bend, to focus, channeling itself directly through her. With the surge of power came a dizzying flood of ancestral knowledge, images and feelings that were not her own. She saw faces with her eyes, felt power in her hands, and she understood. She was not the descendant of traitors. Her bloodline was a rare, ancient, and sacred thing. They were moon healers, a line of wolves with the ability to soothe the savage beast, to mend the spirit, to channel the goddess's very essence. Her parents hadn't been traitors. They had been a threat to a dark power of the past, and they had been eliminated, their legacy twisted into a curse. The flaw she had carried her entire life, the source of all her pain, was never a flaw at all. It was her greatest strength. Her touch did more than just halt his agonizing transformation. The silver light sank deeper, finding the old festering wound on his soul, the damage from the northern skirmish, and it began to soothe the scarred spiritual tissue. The tormented rage in his eyes cleared, replaced by a dawning, blazing hope as he stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. He was not just looking at his mate. He was looking at his salvation. Across the hall, Lord Valerius and the elders stared in abject horror. The weapon they had wielded against their king, the narrative of her tainted blood, had just been obliterated by a display of divine, miraculous power. The traitor they had condemned was, it seemed, touched by the goddess herself. And in the stunned, reverent silence, a new, terrifying question began to form. What have we done? Chapter 20. The Blood Oath. The Great Hall was trapped in a state of stunned, absolute silence. The miracle had left them breathless. Kalen, his wolf steady and calm for the first time in 5 agonizing years, seized the advantage. He took Kelly's hand, his grip no longer a brand of ownership but a gesture of profound partnership. He led her from the platform, his gaze daring anyone to challenge them now. For the first time, the council was silent. They were too shocked, too afraid of the divine power they had just witnessed to even speak. Back in the king's chambers, the world had been remade. He was no longer just her protector. He was her devotee. He looked at her with an awe that humbled her. The great Alpha King brought to his knees not by force, but by a grace he never knew existed. She, in turn, was filled with a confidence she had never known, a quiet strength that came from finally understanding her own worth. "My parents," she began, her voice clear and strong, telling him everything she had seen, everything she now knew. "They weren't traitors, Kalen. They were healers. I think someone in the old king's court feared their power, and so they were framed, destroyed." Together they looked at the pieces of the puzzle, the council's desperate, vicious campaign against her, Lord Valerius's obsession with her tainted blood. It was all built on a foundation of lies, a convenient story used to control the pack and the throne for decades. But how could they prove it? How could they show the pack that her power was a blessing, not a curse? Kalen, his mind sharp and clear now that the static of his wounded wolf was gone, spoke of a legend, a dangerous, forgotten ritual. "The Blood Oath," he said, his voice low and intense. "A bonding ceremony, performed under the light of the full moon, before the entire pack. We would offer our blood, our spirits, our very souls to each other and to the goddess. It is the ultimate rite. If it succeeds, our bond will be absolute, a connection no one can ever deny. Your power will be sealed as a divine gift." He paused, his eyes serious. "But if it fails, it could shatter us both. Our spirits could be consumed." It was an all-or-nothing gambit, a leap of faith that would either save their kingdom or doom it completely. There was no other way. "We'll do it," Kelly said, her voice unwavering. Their love, her power, and his crown were now a single tangled thread. As they stood together, a new team forged in moonlight and revelation. The chamber door burst open. A royal guard, his face pale and bleeding from a cut on his cheek, stumbled in. "My king!" he gasped, breathless. "Lord Valerius, he's made his move. He and his loyalists are storming the royal wing. The castle is breached. He's led assassins inside." The sounds of battle, the clash of steel, the snarls of fighting wolves, erupted from the corridor, a sudden, violent reality crashing down upon them. Their sacred, hopeful plan had just collided with the council's final murderous act of desperation. The battle was no longer a matter of politics or rituals. It was here. It was now. And it was for their lives. Chapter 21. A Queen's First Battle. The heavy oak doors of the chamber splintered, exploding inward in a shower of debris. Assassins, their faces grim masks of fanaticism, poured into the room, blades held ready. They were the council's final, bloody answer. But Kalen was ready. With a roar that was pure, untainted alpha power, he let his wolf take over. The shift was instantaneous, a breathtaking whirlwind of shadow and strength. Where the man had stood, a massive black wolf now stood in his place, his form larger and more powerful than she had ever seen him, his golden eyes blazing with the clear, cold light of a king at war. He was no longer a broken beast. He was magnificent. He met the assassin's charge like a tidal wave crashing against a rocky shore, a storm of black fur, flashing claws, and snapping teeth. The battle was a whirlwind of brutal, chaotic violence. Kalen was a force of nature, his every move a testament to the Alpha King he was always meant to be. He fought to protect his chambers, to protect the pups, to protect her. But there were too many of them, their attacks coordinated, their purpose singular. They were trying to get past him to reach the true target of the council's hatred. The pups, awakened by the terrifying clash of the fight, began to wail from the small, protected alcove where they slept. Their cries of fear cut through the din of battle, straight into Kelly's heart. The last vestiges of the frightened, cowering nanny burned away in that instant, consumed by a fire far hotter. She was no longer a servant to be saved. She was a Luna. And this was her den. An assassin, quick and wiry, slipped past Kalen's flank, his poisoned dagger raised, his eyes fixed on the sound of the crying infants. He saw them as leverage, as a weakness. He was wrong. Kelly moved without thinking, her fear transmuted into a pure, primal ferocity. She grabbed the heavy, ornate chair she had been sitting in and swung it with a desperate strength she didn't know she possessed. The solid wood crashed against the assassin's side, sending him stumbling, his attack thwarted. She was not a trained warrior, she held no weapon, but she was a mother protecting her young. Her raw, courageous act gave Kalen the single moment he needed. He spun, his massive jaws closing around the attacker, ending the threat permanently. For that one, brilliant moment, she had fought with him. A partner in battle. As the fight raged on, a desperate assassin made a final lunge, his poisoned blade slicing a deep gash along Kalen's flank. The king's wolf let out a pained yelp, but finished the last attacker before the toxin could take hold. As the final enemy fell, Kalen stumbled, his massive form wavering, a whimpering sound escaping his throat as the poison began its deadly work. He collapsed onto the floor, the great wolf suddenly vulnerable. Without a second of hesitation, Kelly was at his side. She pressed her hands to the bleeding, blackened wound, calling on the strange, silvery power within her. But it wasn't enough. The poison was too strong, too fast. Acting on an instinct deeper than thought, she did the unthinkable. She bit down hard on her own wrist, tearing the skin and pressed the bleeding wound against his. Her blood, the sacred blood of a moon healer, sizzled as it met his tainted flesh. The silver light flared, no longer just soothing but aggressively cleansing, neutralizing the poison and beginning to knit the torn muscle back together. As the sounds of the wider battle raged on outside, she knelt on the floor of their ruined chambers, healing her fallen king with her own life force, proving her worth not to a council or a pack, but to him, in the most visceral way imaginable. Chapter 22. Two Souls, One Fire. The aftermath of the battle was a ruin of splintered wood and fallen bodies, but through the chaos, a new, fragile order was being born. Kalen, weak from the poisoned blade but whole in spirit, stood beside her. His wolf was a calm, steady presence within him, a quiet hum of power where a raging storm had once lived. They stood in the center of the great hall, surrounded not by enemies, but by the stunned, wide-eyed survivors of the pack. They had seen her heal him, They had seen her fight for the pups. They had seen a miracle, and it had left them speechless. The full moon, high and perfect in the night sky, poured its silver light through the shattered stained glass windows, bathing the scene in a sacred glow. This was the moment. There would not be another. With a strength that seemed to flow from Kelly herself, Kalen addressed his people. His voice was raw but unwavering, echoing in the cavernous, silent hall. He told them of the council's decades of lies, of their plot to control the throne, of the true, noble bloodline of the woman who stood beside him. Then he raised his voice, a king making his final binding declaration. The laws of men have failed us. The traditions of the past have been twisted into weapons. Tonight, we will not put our faith in the words of wolves, but in the will of the goddess herself. He looked at Kelly, his eyes filled with absolute trust. We will perform the blood oath, here, now, and let the moon be our witness and our judge. A collective gasp of fear and awe went through the pack. The blood oath was a myth, a legend, a ritual so dangerous no one had attempted it in 500 years. Kalen took the ceremonial dagger from a fallen guard's belt, the same blade he had once offered with his crown. He did not hesitate. He drew a sharp, clean line across his own palm, the dark blood welling instantly. Then, with a reverence that made her heart ache, he took her hand. His touch was infinitely gentle as he made a matching cut on her soft palm. The sting was a distant thing, meaningless. He pressed their bleeding hands together, flesh to flesh, blood to blood. As their wounds met, the moonlight in the room seemed to coalesce, to focus into a single intense beam that engulfed them both. Kelly felt his soul touch hers, the raw, untamed power of the Alpha King, his unwavering devotion, his deep, abiding love for his people. And she, in turn, opened her own spirit to him. She felt the last, gray remnants of the wound from the northern skirmish, the spiritual fog that had plagued him for years, and she poured her silver light into it, cleansing the last of the shadows. In return, his strength flooded into her, a tidal wave of pure alpha power that did not consume her, but completed her. It washed away the last faded whispers of unworthiness, the final ghosts of her past, filling all the hollow places inside her with his unshakable belief in her. The weak, flickering spark that had connected them for months didn't just ignite. It erupted. It exploded into a roaring, transcendent inferno. Their souls intertwined, their thoughts and emotions bleeding into one another until they were no longer two separate beings, but two halves of a single perfect whole. A wave of pure, divine energy radiated from their joined hands, a silent, powerful benediction that washed over every wolf in the hall. It was a feeling of profound peace, of absolute rightness, of a sacred balance restored. And in perfect, unrehearsed unison, every wolf in the great hall, noble, guard, and servant alike, sank to one knee, not for their king, but for their king and their queen. Chapter 23. The Kneeling King. The divine energy slowly receded, leaving behind a quiet so pure and sacred it felt like a prayer. The great hall was filled with the silent, humbling sight of the entire pack, kneeling in reverence. Kelly looked out at the sea of bowed heads, her heart a symphony of emotions too vast to name. The invisible nanny, the disgraced Omega, the traitor's whelp, all of those fragile, broken versions of herself were gone, burned away in the fire of the blood oath. She was Luna, and she was home. Kalen gently unclasped their hands. She looked down to see that his palm and her own were completely healed, leaving behind only a thin, shimmering silver line on their skin, a permanent physical mark of their bonded souls. He turned to her, and the love shining in his golden eyes was so profound, so absolute, it was more brilliant than the moonlight itself. Then he did something that shattered 1,000 years of tradition, an act of devotion so radical it would be spoken of for generations. The Alpha King, Kalen the Unbroken, the victor of a dozen battles and the ruler of the strongest pack on the continent, slowly, deliberately, sank to one knee before her, before his mate, before his queen. He took her hand, not with the possessive grip of a king, but with the gentle worship of a devoted subject. "Kelly," he said, his voice thick with emotion, yet strong enough for every wolf to hear. "You faced down my enemies. You healed my wolf. You saved my soul." His gaze was an oath, a vow more binding than any law. "My life, my crown, my heart, they were always yours. From the moment I heard your song, I was yours." This was the new order. Not a king who ruled over his mate, but a king who knelt before her, their strengths intertwined, their power a perfect, unbreakable circle. As if on cue, a small commotion came from the side of the hall. A trusted guard, his face beaming, gently guided two small figures forward. Lyra and Leo. No longer crying, no longer afraid, they toddled on unsteady legs across the stone floor, their eyes fixed on the one person in the world who was their true north. They bypassed the kneeling king and went straight to Kelly, their small hands clinging to the fabric of her dress. They looked up at her, their faces filled with a pure, uncomplicated adoration that healed the last of her hidden scars. This was the only judgment, the only acceptance, that had ever truly mattered. With a laugh that was half a sob, Kelly knelt down, mirroring her king, and scooped the two pups into her arms. Their small, warm bodies fit against her as if they were pieces of her own soul, their familiar scent a balm to her spirit. She looked from their trusting faces to her kneeling king, to her devoted pack. The hollow ache in her chest, the ghost she had carried since she was a child, was finally, completely, and irrevocably gone. This was her family. This was her pack. The kingdom was no longer a place of fear and secrets, but one forged in a love that had been tested by fire and blessed by the moon itself. She was home. Chapter 24. Always My Queen. Weeks later, the Great Hall was unrecognizable. The scars of battle had been replaced by garlands of white moonflowers, their sweet, heady scent filling the air. Silver banners bearing the new sigil of a black wolf and a silver moon intertwined hung from the rafters. Today was not a trial or a battle. It was a celebration, a coronation, a promise of a new beginning. As Kelly stood at the back of the hall, she felt a tremor of nerves, but it was a joyful, exhilarating feeling, not the cold dread of her past. She was not afraid of being seen anymore. She was ready to be seen. The music began, a soft, beautiful melody that spoke of hope and renewal. She walked down the long aisle, her steps steady and sure. The entire pack was present, and as she passed, they looked at her not with scorn or suspicion, but with a genuine, heartfelt reverence and love. Just ahead of her, Lyra and Leo toddled along, scattering moonflower petals with a joyous, clumsy abandon. They reached the dais, where Kaelin waited. The look on his face, the pure, undiluted happiness that lit him from within, made him seem younger, chasing away the last of the shadows that had haunted him for so long. He was not just a king. He was a man who was deeply, truly, and completely in love. He did not allow an elder to preside over the ceremony. This was too personal, too sacred. He took her hands in his touch both a comfort and a thrill. A guard brought forward the Luna's crown on a velvet cushion. It was not a heavy, opulent thing of gold and jewels. It was a delicate, ethereal circlet of woven silver, shaped like intertwined vines of the moonflower, a single perfect pearl resting in the center. Kaelin took the crown, holding it up for the pack to see. But before he placed it on her head, he spoke, his final vow to her, to them, a testament to their entire journey. "The world saw you as a servant," he said, his voice ringing with a passion that captivated every soul in the hall. "They saw you as a nanny, a whisper in the walls, a shadow to be overlooked. They were blind." He looked directly into her eyes then, his soul laid bare for her and for all the world to see. His voice dropped, becoming an intimate promise meant only for her, yet heard by all. I see you, Kelly. From the very first moment I heard your voice, my soul recognized yours. He smiled, a genuine, breathtaking expression of pure joy. You were never just the nanny. You were never a placeholder. In my heart, you were always my queen. With infinite tenderness, he gently placed the silver crown upon her head. It settled as if it were made for her, a cool, light weight of destiny. The pack erupted, not in a formal cheer, but in a joyous, unrestrained roar of love and celebration. Kaylin leaned in and kissed her, a deep, passionate kiss filled with the promise of 1,000 tomorrows, a future they would build together. As they finally broke apart, he pulled her close, the pups now held securely in their arms, a perfect, complete family, looking out at their united, hopeful kingdom. The invisible girl was gone forever, and in her place stood a beloved queen, her worth no longer a question, but the unshakable foundation of a new world. Thank you so much for watching this video. We really appreciate you spending your time with us. If you enjoyed what you saw, we've got a whole library of other videos packed with more great content just like this waiting for you on our channel. So, why not dive into another one right now? And hey, if you want to make sure you don't miss out on our next upload, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. We'd love to have you join our community and see you in the next video. Thanks again.